watched the news and have struggled with seeing the scenes as Putin's war machine has ground up the country of Ukraine. Any of those eastern countries that would have been attacked would have been bad enough. In fact, probably those plans have already been laid as well. But we know Ukraine. We have connections with Ukrainians. We began a relationship with Christians in Ukraine back in 1992, and it continues to the day. So the people that are in Putin's sights are people that we know, people that we love, people that we have relationships with, people that some of you have met, the people that have actually come to this country at times. And so we are taking this just a little bit personal and are extremely concerned. There are some Christian leaders that are extremely concerned, but for entirely different reason. For whatever reason, at some point years ago, there are evangelical leaders that began to uphold Putin as an example of a faithful Christian world leader. In fact, in 2016, Franklin Graham made a trip to Moscow to visit with Putin, where he lauded Putin for his defense of traditional Christian values, meaning that he made homosexuality illegal, was throwing homosexuals in prison. And at the same time and in the same speech, he lambasted then President Obama as being a purveyor of atheism. Just this past week, they brought Pat Roberson out of retirement, and he made a comment that he believed it was God's will that Putin attack and destroy Ukraine because that would bring about a more rapid battle of Armageddon. Sometimes words in the past come back to haunt you. Sometimes false ideas come home to roost, and those certainly have. I would think that if you're going to choose a world leader that is going to be a defender of traditional Christian values, you might want to pick one that's not willing to murder millions of people if that's what it takes. We continue our look at the Ten Commandments as we've been working our way through the book of Exodus, and we come to thou shalt not kill. Now I realize some these commandments have more practical application and personal application than others do. And I'm sure that no one needs to be told, don't go out and kill anybody this week. Mostly, that's one of the things that we sort of take pride in, that we keep the Ten Commandments, starting with the fact that we haven't personally killed anyone. The King James has thou shalt not kill. The newer translation have you shall not commit murder. That's the NIV, and most of the newer translations, even the New King James. And the reason for that is simple. We run into instances in the law where taking a human life is commanded, and therefore there seems to be a little bit of a dissonance when it says thou shalt not kill, and if you break it, then you are killed. There was a guy by the name of Clay Allison that was a former Confederate soldier, became a cattleman, and then he became, in his words, a shootist or a gunfighter. And on his tomb, he died in 1884, and on his tombstone is written the epitaph, he never killed a man that didn't need killing. And so some of the newer translations translate you shall not commit murder because later on in the law, God evidently thinks there are some people that need killing. Well, maybe the best translation, because I'm such a Hebrew scholar, would be do not commit homicide. Homicide is a general term that means man killing. That's literally what it means from the Latin. And it's a term that is applied in our legal system to any type of killing. Premeditated homicide is murder, but then there's justifiable homicide, which is not murder. Homicide is a broad term, and as it turns out, the word that is used in the Hebrew that is translated do not kill or do not murder is a general word that is applied a little bit later in the text, we'll see, when it talks about somebody that accidentally kills someone else. There was an accidental homicide, and we'll see some instructions on that. So actually the commandment is meant to forbid intentional murder. So the NIV is right. But then there is in this commandment a more general statement of the respect for the sanctity of human life. So do not kill. The King James is right as well. This basic statement of the sanctity of life actually dates back to the days right after the greatest taking of human life in human history, after the flood. God has hit the reset button on his world and on his rebellious children. Only 8 remain, and now from Noah and his family, all mankind is going to repopulate the earth. And so as they leave the ark, there is the rainbow that promises that destruction will never happen again. And then there's some statements that are made. Noah and his family are allowed now to eat meat. From the instruction in the Garden of Eden, it seems that Adam and Eve were vegan. But now God tells Noah and his family, you can kill of any of these animals and eat. You couldn't do that on the ark. There was that unfortunate unicorn barbecue. But they couldn't eat all the animals on the ark, but once they leave the ark, now they can become meat eaters. But there's a restriction. And the restriction is that in God's economy, blood has a special significance, and so they were forbidden from eating the blood. But you must not, this is Genesis 9, verse 4, but you must not eat meat that has its lifeblood still in it. For your lifeblood I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal. So you can kill an animal and eat it, but you must drain its lifeblood. And then he goes on to say, which kind of sets the groundwork for this respect for the sanctity of human life, and from each human being, too, I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. When one human being takes the life of another human being, then there's going to be an accounting. So God goes on in verse 6, whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made mankind. So there is this basic statement that humankinds are different or special because they are made in the image of God, and because they are made in the image of God, they are not to take the life of another one made in the image of God. Now, there's going to be all kinds of human history, some ordained by God, where we're going to see exceptions to that. But all human interaction begins with this respect for the sanctity of human life, based upon the fact that we are made in the image of God. Right after God says that in Genesis 1. First he has the idea, why don't we make man in our image? And then there's a statement of the fact. So God made man in his image. Male and female created he them. And then the very next statement is, he speaks to the humankind that he's created, and he says, you shall have dominion over the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and the fish of the sea. See, part of the specialness of humankind is we are made in the image of God, which makes us different from all the other animals. We were created by God to be the pinnacle of his creation, the apex predator of all of creation, because we are made in the image of God. And because of that, human life is sacred. Now, we've been mentioning throughout this series that the Ten Commandments are not the most important part of the Old Testament law. It wasn't that the Ten Commandments were given on these stone tablets and they're the most important statements, because when Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment was, he picks one from Deuteronomy. The Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then he chose the second one from Leviticus. Love your neighbor as yourself. The Ten Commandments represent the rest of the law. They were what we've been calling chapter headings under which the rest of the covenant of God's law is organized. And so that is going to be explained later on. It's interesting that right after the chapter that has the Ten Commandments, chapter 20 of Exodus, chapter 21 begins a section of laws and various commands. These are added to in Leviticus and added to and restated in Deuteronomy. But it's interesting that one of the very first sections as Exodus continues in giving the specifics of the law is this one, Exodus 21, verse 12. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. Okay, that's kind of a restatement of what we saw in Genesis 9, right? But then he continues, however, if it is not done intentionally, But God lets it happen. God has control, has sovereignty over human life. And so that there are some situations that things just happen that truly are acts of God, not meaning that God does it specifically, but are under the domain of God. If it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place that I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. Okay, now this is kind of a very brief statement of a principle that's going to be amplified on in both Leviticus or Numbers, actually, and then again in Deuteronomy, as there is this statement of, when you get into the land, of course, as the law is given here, they're not in the promised land, but when you get into the land, you are to set up special cities called the cities of refuge. You see, when they move into the land that God is going to give them, there is no central government. There's not going to be a central Israelite government until much, much later in their history, King Saul and then, of course, King David. So people live together in families and in extended families and clans and tribes. And it is the community in which they live that is responsible for making sure God's law is followed. We saw last week how if someone has a rebellious child that's a drunkard and a glutton and won't listen to his parents, he is to be taken to the elders of the city. The community is to deal with that. It is the community that has responsibility for making sure that the law is followed. So anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. It is explained later to us that it is the family of the one that is killed, the avenger of blood, the kinsman redeemer, he's called in another context, that is to take the life of the person that has committed the killing. But the person that kills is to flee to one of these cities of refuge, set up throughout the land of Israel, administered by the Levites, and there he will be given by the elders of the city a trial to determine whether or not the killing takes place intentionally or accidentally. If it's intentional, then they are handed over to the avenger of blood and their life is taken just as God commanded. But if it is determined that the killing was not intentional, that it was accidental, then they are allowed to live in the city of refuge, and it's a life sentence, not their own life, the life of the high priest. They are to live in the city of refuge, and they're safe, protected from the avenger of blood until the death of the high priest, when all of the debts are wiped off the books. Remember, God said that there would be an accounting when any time a human being shed the blood of another human being. Here, if a person accidentally, later in the law, some examples are given, like you're chopping down a tree, the axe head flies off your axe and hits and kills someone. So you go to the city of refuge, and you're pronounced innocent of murder. But there is still an accounting. You have to live in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. This idea of the sacredness, the sanctity of human life. It's illustrated again in the next chapter. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if what happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. So you're at home, somebody breaks into your house to steal your stereo or whatever. What are you supposed to do? Depends what time of day it is. If it's nighttime, most of us don't have a lot of experience living in a place that has absolutely no artificially man-made light. But when you're in the wilderness and the only light that is there is light that you kindle yourself, fires and torches, that kind of thing, and you've got to find a hunk of rock and strike it together in order to get that. You can't get up and just turn lights on. And so if somebody breaks in at night when your family is put to bed, your children are in their place, and they break into your house, you don't know whether they're there to rob you, to kill you and your wife so that they can take your children slaves. You don't know. And so you are permitted to fight and to kill in that situation. But if they break in in the middle of the day. You come home for lunch and there's somebody rummaging through your stuff. You are not permitted to use violence in order to prevent that. You have to simply walk away and then let the law take care of the thief later. Now he goes on in the second part of verse 3 to say, anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay. Well, that's interesting. They must be sold to pay for what they owe because of their debt. There it is. They must pay back double. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, they must pay back double. Okay, now, the basic, again, this is just a very brief introduction. All of this is going to be spelled out. And there's going to be some differences, what kind of animal is stolen. But basically, the point is, if you steal property, you're punished with property. So if you steal an animal, you got to give back the animal, plus you got to give back double. If you don't have the animal and you don't have the way to make the deed right financially, then you're sold into slavery, and that money is used to make things right. Understand that slavery in the Old Testament was more like indentured servanthood when one Jew owned another. So basically people served 7-year sentences, but that should be enough to pay off whatever debt they owed because of the thief. What they're not allowed to do is to kill the thief. Now I know this sounds maybe un-American, because maybe it is un-American. But basically the life of the thief is worth more than anything that you own. It's not worth risking your life, and it's not worth risking and taking the life of the thief. That is God's stress on the sanctity of life. That life is precious, it is sacred, it belongs to Him. And therefore, I think you can make an argument that in this Old Testament law that is so barbaric in places, and their life seems so cheap, and some of the stories that we see in the Old Testament. But if they really would have followed this law as God lays it out, maybe their view of the sanctity of life is higher than ours. There are 25 states in the United States that have what they call stand your ground, hard versions of stand your ground. We're going to see a soft version in just a second. In the hard version of stand your ground, you are never required to de-escalate a situation. If somebody attacks you or threatens you or tries to steal your property, you can stand your ground and use violence even as a first act to prevent them from doing that. There are 11 states, by the way, that have the exact opposite, the turn and flee law, that says basically that if you're put in a situation where somebody is trying to rob you or hurt you or harm you in any way, and you can leave and move yourself from the situation safely, you are required to do that. Virginia is a stand your ground state, but in the soft variety. And Virginia's version of it. I took a business law class when I was in high school. It was an option at Mitchell High School, and I took it. And didn't spend a lot of time talking about business law. It was more like introduction to the law. That's when I decided I don't want to be a lawyer, which is pretty good because I'm not smart enough to be one. But I remember the teacher telling us that if somebody breaks in your house and you're forced to use violence, and they crawl out of a window and die, you better go in your front yard and pull them back inside and let the police find them inside your house. Because all of the states of the Union have a home is your castle law that says basically you can use whatever force you want to protect yourself from somebody that invades your property. Okay, that's my introduction to the law, which is what Jesus had in mind when he talked about the blind, leading the blind. The point is, the Old Testament law, which is what we're looking at, God's idea of the sanctity of life did not have a stand your ground law. And it did not have your home is your castle law. It had, if the thief breaks in the middle of the day, it had run from your house screaming like a little girl law. That you were required to remove yourself from the situation where you might harm another person and let the community take care of the property crime. because of this emphasis on the sanctity of human life. That human life to God was sacred because He created it. All through the Old Testament is this idea that God has control over life, that we don't. Now, we could spend a lot of time talking about a lot of different stuff, and we would probably have a lot of different disagreements over exactly how to apply this. And I'm not arguing for any one application of any of these things. Maybe we'll talk about some of these on Wednesday night if somebody wants to ask the question. But when is it allowed for a Christian to go to war and participate in war? Anytime your country invades or goes to war, or just if it's a just war, which has kind of been the Christian tradition through the years? What about the death penalty, which seems to be talked about a lot in the Old Testament? What about euthanasia and assisted suicide? What about abortion? At the center of the abortion debate is this respect for the sanctity of human life. And then what about Christian pacifism? Maybe we could have a discussion about that sometime. We had an old brother that was here years ago that was an adamant pacifist. And as far as I could tell, he was a very consistent one in his beliefs and his practices. We had another brother that was here when I moved here years ago that was in the military, stationed at Fort Eustis. And while I was here, he got a conscientious objector discharge from the Army because he decided he could no longer participate in an organization whose main job was to kill people and destroy things. Our movement spent the first 100 years of its existence with pacifism as its main application for Christians. The people they named Christian colleges after, like David Lipscomb and James A. Harding, were adamant pacifists, didn't believe the Christian could participate in the state at all. Okay, my goal this morning is not to convince you to become a pacifist, of course. We can have interesting discussions about all of those things. I think all of those questions are nuanced and much more complex than we might want to think, and there may be a difference of opinion among believers in Christ more than we think on all of those. Imagine being a consistent pacifist in a congregation that is made up 50% of military. Because back in those days it was. Brother Ross was not very comfortable, but he was faithful. I couldn't change his mind. And it was interesting how his attitude changed when one Wednesday night I gave him the Wednesday night class to make his case for Christian pacifism. He just wanted to be heard, and I allowed him to be heard. And after that, his stress level went way down. In other words, he told us the truth. We can go to hell if we want. But he did his job in telling us the truth. I think there's something to be said about that. The point this morning is simply to stress this. No matter where we come out on those issues and issues like them, no matter what decision that we make, no matter what nuance we might lean to, we've got to start the discussion with the absolute commitment of the sanctity of human life. That God created every human being, and therefore every human being has immense value in the sight of God and therefore God's people. Does that mean you can't be in the military? Does that mean you can't own a gun? Does that mean we have to start our reasoning based on this assumption that God values human life and respect differences in other people that may come down in a different place? It was hard for me sometimes, but I did have a great deal of respect for Brother Ross. He was very irritating because he couldn't get up and tell everybody what he thought, so he would drop by my office once or twice a week and tell me what he thought. But the idea is he had a great deal of respect for the sanctity of human life. I hope I have a great deal of respect for the sanctity of human life. And we have to, wherever we deal with issues, we have to start there. Let's pray together. Father, we are so grateful for the knowledge that you created us in your image. And Father, help us to look deep within ourselves every day and allow that glimmer of the divine to come out and let other people see that in our commitment to be living for you. And Father, help us to wrestle with hard questions. And Father, our hearts and minds are directed to Ukraine and to the struggle that's going on there. We ask, Father, particularly that you protect your people and that you bring peace to that area quickly. Father, help us to be truly convinced that every life over there is worthy of our concern, that we pray for the Ukrainians. We also pray for the Russians that are invading. We also pray for the heart of Vladimir Putin, that you will turn it away from war. Help us, Father, to be people of peace. Help us to long for the time when there is perfect peace. Father, we're so grateful that we can be together and deal with hard questions. Help us as we live this week to reflect your goodness.